Hello everybody. Have you ever wondered how you can go from a sketch of something to transferring it onto some watercolor paper in its most essential look and then finishing it in color and detail? Well, in this series, we're going to learn about all the different basic techniques that are going to help you get there. Welcome everybody. In this section, we're going to discuss watercolor techniques that are going to be great introduction to get you started with controlling watercolor. I have everything I need for today. I have a backer board to support my watercolor paper so it doesn't want to bow too much. I have my tape to tape down. I also have a cup of water and some paper towel for drying and my watercolors and my watercolored brush. And you can have a few different types of watercolor brushes. So let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is to prepare my watercolor paper. You can use either side of your watercolor paper. They both have a texture to them. And I want to make sure my backer board is at least a half-inch bigger than my paper. And this board can be anything from cardboard. This is kind of a compressed cardboard here. It could be a piece of hard-ridged paper, but something like cardboard is the best. So what I'll do is I'm going to tape down probably like the last 1/4 inch of the paper onto here. When you guys are working on watercolor pieces, you always want to tape down your work. That way it prevents the paper from bowing and helps the paper settle down flat when it completely dries. So we overlap all the way around. We don't just do the ends of the paper. We tape down the whole piece. It's the best way to go. And I prefer masking tape over Scotch tape. Masking tape holds better as well. So there we go. We're all set with that. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some a few different techniques today. So to just make sure that's kind of easily seen, I'm also going to tape off and break up these sections of my demo paper. You all received an additional piece of watercolor paper for you to test out in color with. So you can be using that for practice work. So there we go. I broke it up in 4. Okay, now we're ready to go. In this first area here, we're going to do something called a flat wash, and then we're going to return back to it. So a flat wash means a flat layer of color. So I'm going to wet my brush in some water. What I like to do is, here I'll get my cup, I like to wet it and then dab it on the side so it stops all the drips from the water coming. And if I was going to fill an area with like one big color, like I was going to fill it in, I would create that color on my palette here. So let's say, for example, I'm going to take some red. I'm going to kind of work it in over here. I'll get a little bit more water on my brush, kind of drop it in there. Because I want to make enough watercolor that's going to take care of that. I'm going to get a little more red. Work it in there. So now I have like a good amount of red here that's going to be able to fill that space. If I wanted to create my own unique color at this time, of course, I could like mix a color batch right there on my palette. What I'm going to do is I'm going to fill this space. And the reason I wanted to kind of have enough red here is so I don't have to keep making it over and over again. So what I'm going to do is to get a flat color in, I'm going to start to paint here. And if I lean the paper, it kind of drags the wet edge of my watercolor there, and it keeps it from creating a line over time. I'm just going to grab it and kind of keep pulling that over. So I'm just grabbing my watercolor, and I'm grabbing that edge, and it's just pulling it over. So I'm tilting the paper just slightly to have a little bit of gravity pull it down. You can see that gravity is holding the watercolor there on my brush edge. So again, I'm just touching the edge and grabbing that with some new watercolor. If it ever gets too dry here and it doesn't look like this, just get a little more watercolor on it. This will again help prevent any type of like lines from the watercolor existing on this type of coverage you're doing. As I get close to the edge here, maybe I don't need to go get more watercolor. I could just drag this because there's plenty of watercolor on here. And there you go. If you have a little bit of extra left there, it's not a big deal. But if you don't want it, you can get your brush, dry it on some paper towel, and when it's dry, it can act like a vacuum, and I can suck up some of that excess. See? And then I'm going to let that lay flat and dry, and that gives me something called a flat wash. You fill an area with one color. We'll revisit this in a few minutes to try something else. And you can always tell watercolor is wet when it shines back at you. So that's how you know, stay away from that area if you don't want to mess it up. You got to leave it alone until it dries. And a layer like this will probably be dry in about 3 or 4 minutes. Moving on to our next section, we're going to do something called a gradient. A gradient is something that if you've ever shaded a drawing before, we're going to go from an intense version of a color back to white of the paper, or like create a fade from more of an intense color to a softer color. Let's try another color now. I'll utilize the green. So again, I'm just going to wake up my green here. I'll make a little batch right there for myself. Okay, and I'm just going to grab a pencil. I'm going to kind of create a line here because maybe I'm going to try a couple different ones. I'll try the green on this side. Let's say I wanted the green to be more intense here and less intense as I go across the paper. How do we do that? Well, let's learn. So what I'm going to do is with a wet brush, I'm going to grab my green. I'm going to start just like I did the flat wash before. Oh, I got a little drippy there. No big deal. So I'm going to put that intense green here. But now I want to start to fade it. So how do I start to fade it? Similar to what I did with the last wash, I want to tilt it. Kind of keep a wet edge here. That'll prevent any line from being created. So we have a wet edge. I'm going to clean my brush, free of any more paint. And with a wet brush, I'm going to start to pull the green across. Again, I'm going to clean my brush. And with just water, no paint on the brush, I'm going to pull that across. Now you can already see that this is lighter than that. But to intensify the effect, if I lean it up and let gravity pull it down, I can also create a gradient that way. So if I lay it down, you can see it almost looks like a misty landscape. So now I have a light green there and a deeper green there. And if I want to smoothen this transition with a clean brush, I can kind of just go back and forth very softly to kind of tame down that. Again, I have no color on my brush. And there we get a fade happening. It can be more intense than this or less intense than this. If I overblend it now, I can make it all the same color. And that could be something I don't want. So with a clean brush, if I want it to be lighter here, I can actually push the green more to the right. So it's more concentrated over there and less concentrated over there. This is a technique we use a lot in art making. I'm going to do a little demonstration of how that could be done. And what we're going to do is I'm going to make a sphere. So we're going to make a circle here. Okay. And let's imagine this circle is a ball and it has a little cast shadow. I'll put a little background to it. And we're going to say that light is coming this way. If light is hitting this ball here, it's going to be lighter here and darker there. So knowing how to do a gradient is a really good idea. So again, I'm going to do it in green because I just used green. I'm going to put the green down where the color would be more intense, which would be about right here. In the bottom third of the ball. Kind of going with the shape there. Now I'm going to clean my brush. with some clean water, and you can see I have clean water here because there's no paint on it. I'm rubbing in water, and I'm going to go and grab this edge and wet it up. I can now pull that green up, and you can see I have a lighter green here because it's mostly water. But to get the round feature of that, I'm going to kind of rotate with the roundness of the sphere shape. I'm going to kind of work it around, just gently kind of pushing it around, retaining this lighter area here, and just gently kind of working those together. And that's how a gradient can be used to make something a little bit more three-dimensional. Later on, maybe I'll come back and like finish the shading on this before the end of the video. It's not a good idea for me to do the shading now because the color's probably going to get too wet and merge with that. Just going to flip my paper around just to see the red is not wet anymore. It's not shining back at me, while these areas are still wet because they're shining back at me. Okay. Now what we're going to do here is something a lot of people like to do. We're going to do the sunset effect where you fade one color into another. That's called a variegated wash. It's a variation gradient. So we want to imagine, let's imagine, I'm going to start with yellow here, and I'm going to fade to a red over here. So I'll just put a little label there, red, yellow. I'll show you how we do that. I take some yellow, put it in there. And I always like to have a little bit of pre-mixed stuff on my palette, so it's really easy to grab, and it's the strength I want. I'm also going to think about the other color I want, and I think I said red, so I'm just going to kind of wet this red batch a little bit more. There we go. And anytime you want to clean your palette, just get a wet paper towel and wipe it off. All right, so let's do that type of wash. I can start with yellow or red, but I typically like to start with my lighter intense color. So for me, it's the yellow. So I'm going to grab the yellow here. And if I want to fade down, I'm going to brush across. So I'm going to start brushing my yellow across like this. And if I want to make sure I get a smooth result, not a bad idea for me to tilt the paper here as well. This might get a little shiny for you guys to see on the video. But as you can see, I have like a wetter edge down here. And I'm going to go about halfway down, maybe a little bit past. And I want to make sure that yellow has a lot of paint here. So you can see a difference there because that's a wet edge. Now from the opposite end, now I'm going to grab some red. Okay, there's a bunch of ways to do this, but I can start grabbing some red and put the red down lower. Keep grabbing my red, and I can work it up. And when it touches the yellow, they're going to interact. Okay, you guys ready? Here we go. They're about to touch now. You can see you kind of get a soft edge created. If I use gravity now, the yellow starts to leach down into the red. You can see all these like little particles of yellow, and they're starting to blend a little bit. But if I want a smoother blend, even though this is kind of a cool texture, it's like tie-dye effect, if I want them to interact a little bit more, even though I have a soft edge there, here's what I can do. I can kind of clean my brush. I'm going to grab a little bit more yellow, and I'm going to start working the yellow in, and I'm going to keep pushing it across like that. And you can see, now I'm going to take the red and I'm just going to gently kind of work it into the yellow, just enough, like that. And when I let gravity work together, I'm just tilting it and holding it for a few seconds. You start to get a fusion of the two colors. This is not where you want to kind of blend this way, because then it'll just mix and make one big kind of batch of a color like an orange. But what you're seeing is a fade from one color to another. You can always kind of smooth it out to get a really slow transition. If you tilt the paper and just kind of gently wash a clean brush across. Again, I don't have any extra paint that I put on my brush. I'm just kind of letting them blend a little bit with a slightly wet brush. So this is kind of like a tie-dye look or a fade. You can practice that a few different ways. All right, there we go. So we have a variegated wash, a gradient, and a flat wash. Okay. Now, as when we go look at the last area here, I'm going to talk about dry brush. Okay, dry brush is when you draw with a brush. So if I wet a brush, and this is a smaller brush here, I could take my finger and kind of bring it to a point too. That can kind of give me more of like a pen-like edge to it, or a marker-like edge. So what's dry brush? Well, that's when you say I wanted to kind of draw some details in. Well, I can get a little water on my brush and a lot of pigment to create a really intense blue. So I don't want it to be like overly watery if I want an intense color. I want more pigment. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to spin my brush on it. Spin it, spin it, spin it, almost like I'm spinning pasta. Helps bring a point to the brush. This could be really good for like doing any type of line work. If you notice your color gets lighter, it just means you might need to go back and grab a little bit more paint. How lightly you touch the paper and how much you touch the paper will change how much watercolor and how wide the line goes down. So dry brush is really good for some detail work. Say I was doing some like tall grass, I'll get some green. I can actually flick for the look of grass. I can dab for some little important textures. Dry brush is for textural work, adding details and textures to things. So those are all right, so let's just say this green ball is sitting on a gray table. So I'm going to grab a little bit of black and a lot of water to make a gray. So I want to stay away from the green here, and your brush will allow you to give you the control. So I want to kind of outline around that green shape, and then I can do a quick fill. I want to put that in first. Later on, I'm going to come back and I'm going to do the shadow here, but I'm going to leave that alone. I just wanted to get the table in. Now above it, let's just say I'm going to do some yellow. So I'll grab some yellow. I'm going to paint that around. There. If the gray is still wet, I got to be very careful here with the yellow so they don't mix together. Okay. Watercolor can always be active, meaning I can go back in here and like recolor into the green and it'll wet itself up again and the green will spread again. So I can always control things. All right, so that's kind of set up for me for in a little bit. Spin my paper. And let's talk about layering, and also let's talk about something called blowback, like when you lose your patience. Say you paint something here. I'm just going to say, let's pretend I'm painting like the side of a building or something. I'll do like a building top, like on a cityscape. Oh, by the way, when like I paint over the red and the blue can go, a darker color goes very nicely over a lighter color. So you'll see maybe a little bit of the red through the blue here, but the blue's dominating. If I tried to bring yellow over the red, you'd see more of an orange. So I can do a really nice job building in. Okay, so we're going to say these are some building tops. Well, here's another fun thing about watercolor. This is how well you can control it. I create an edge, you see that? That's wet. If I were to dump in a bunch of color here, I can like hold it and move it and stuff, but it will never bleed outside that edge I created because this is not wet. That creates a wet barrier. Unless I held it sideways and I shook it like crazy, the watercolor will not leave this area. So, I mean, I could take some green, put some green in there, but it's only going to stay in that blue shape. It will never want to leave that space. I'm just going to intermix them a little bit. Let me rotate, clean up that edge. You can see how I have to like focus to kind of create some clean edges. Cool. Okay, here's the problem that a lot of people run into. I just painted that. It's wet still because it's shining back at me. If I were to come into this background, this like sky, and say I wanted to kind of create a hill or something, I want to wait till that's done to be able to do that. Because if I don't, this is what will happen. I'm going to take some purple, maybe a little bit of brown, and I'm going to create like a background, like silhouette of a hill. So I'm going to start making the hill here. And I'm going to come over here and look, I'm going to touch that building. What happens is I just lost the edge of the building and it's fused with the hill now. Now it won't happen here against the blue because that blue is dry already. But because I'm touching the edge of that building, now I can't tell where the building stops and where the mountain begins. I'll just kind of hold that up close. It doesn't look bad, but in many instances it can be bad. Say you were drawing like a butterfly and you did a beautiful job on its wing, but the wing is still wet. And then you're painting the sky around it, and then the wet sky touches the wet wing, you'll get a distorted edge, and that can be very frustrating. So always have some patience. You can crack open a window, let the window hit your wet watercolor, the wind from the window hit your wet watercolor, it dries it. And secondly, you can use a light hair dryer very lightly to help dry it a little faster if your patience is wearing thin. So that's just one thing to watch out for. Now, if we go back to this now, let's put a little drop shadow on it so this sphere looks a little darker. So since my table is like a gray, I'm going to take the color I used to make gray, which is black. I'm going to make a darker version of it, and I'm going to put my drop shadow here. I already drew it out before too. Not really happy with how the outer edge came out here, but that's okay. So I'm going to draw it in there. I'm going to kind of tighten it up right against there. And you could be done. It's a 3D little ball. But I'm also going to take that a little bit of the color from the shadow and put it on this part of the ball. So I'm doing like a second layer on this ball. So I put a little bit there, clean my brush, and with a dry, clean brush, I'm going to take the edge and just kind of soften it back into the green so it fades pretty quickly. So I'm going to have the gray and the green like intermix here a little bit. And this is a very sensitive approach I'm doing, just a very subtle job of merging the two. And if I ever create like a little white space here, like I did there, maybe I need a little bit more green, kind of to patch up that little issue I had there, and maybe a little bit more of the gray. I'm also going to take a little bit of the green from the sphere and put it in the shadow too. That's what happens with light. And we get a little bit. Now we get like a more composed three-dimensional form right there with the sphere. So we went over a bunch of things. These are things you could practice that could help you in your illustration feel more comfortable with watercolor. Hope that helped everybody. Be well.